working together. And we have to get into the definitions of nature and nurture a little more clearly and figure out where they came from and what exactly they mean. When we define nature and nurture, the traditional view of nature and nurture are seen on this slide here. Nature generally refers to the effect of the biological entity without respect to any external influence. The idea being that it's something like your genes or a biochemical activity inside your head that is completely unaffected by the environment, and that it has kind of a one-way street influence on your development overall. Nurture, in contrast, is the role of the environment. However, this environmental influence is assumed to have no bearing on your biology. Therefore, the food you eat, the air you breathe, the people you speak to, the life you live has no bearing on the underlying biochemical principles by which your body operates. That was the original way in which everything was defined. Some of the examples of nature include things like your genes, the very general term physical maturation, biochemical components of brain function, and common examples of nurture involve things like drugs, because drugs come from outside you, so that would be an environmental influence. Personal memories are things that you experience. The memory, you may think, is a thing inside your brain and therefore it's biological, except the specific memory that you have comes as a result of interacting with the environment, so memories would be referred to as an environmental aspect. And of course, culture, which is just a broader version of the whole story of personal memories. Culture just involves all of the people that you come in contact with in a specific geographic location. The modern interpretation of nature and nurture would very quickly identify that none of these influences on this page is completely biological or environmental. That is, your genes are actually influenced by the environment. So is your physical maturation, and the biochemical activity of your brain and in general your nervous system is influenced by the environment. The opposite is also true with respect to nurture. Drugs, the manner in which you process drugs is affected by your biology. The manner in which you form memories, how well the memory is formed, and how well you retain it is affected by your biology. And in fact, the parameters of your biology influence the degree to which you can actually successfully live in one environment or another. Ultimately, what you see is that all of the environmental inputs that you experience are modified by your pre-existing biology, and all of those inputs also affect biology, so that there is a constant exchange between environment and biology. And this may seem rather odd, but we're going to run through some specific examples in the coming slides. But what is important to grasp at this point is that your genes and the biochemical activity of your body can be modified by select environmental circumstances, which means that your biology is suspect to environmental change. And it's also true that the environmental experiences that you come across are actually modified by your pre-existing biology. The way that you see and hear and smell and taste is in part determined by your species and the way your brain is designed and the location of the receptors, and in fact how the receptors function. There are some things that you don't have receptors for, like electromagnetic radiation, but other creatures do. So there is a interplay between biology and environment that has to be recognized to understand the role of nature and nurture in the 21st century. To get at how this is true, I have a sequence of 3 questions for you. The first one, which of the following behaviors is most highly weighted toward biological causes? Now, you could make an argument for any one of them, but which is most highly weighted toward biology? And the answer would be A, breathing. Why? Because breathing is something that has to happen. You could not survive without breathing or obtaining oxygen. You could live your whole life without reading, speaking, or dancing, but breathing would be highly weighted toward biology. Now, given that we're establishing breathing as being something that's much more weighted toward biology, do you believe that breathing can be modified by an environmental stimulus? And the answer there is definitely yes. There are things in the environment that could make you breathe differently, slower or faster. And in fact, let's take a look at what some of those things might actually be. So, which of the following might influence breathing? And the answer there would be all of the above. Sight of an angry pit bull on your front lawn, the voice of the sexy person who lives next door, bad perfume, running, all these things actually constitute scenarios in which your breathing would wind up changing. So despite the fact that breathing tends to be weighted toward the biological side, it can still be modified by the environment. And breathing is a fairly simple concept to grasp, that how it could be modified by the environment. We're going to actually start taking a look at more complicated versions in a few slides. But one of the basic questions that we actually have to manage at this time is to understand how the environment can modify your genes and how your genes can modify your experience of the environment. To get started with, we have to recognize the role of the field of study called behavioral genetics. The field of behavioral genetics got started at approximately 1980, and that's not a specific point in time. It's about that point when the field developed. Behavioral genetics is, from the name, the combination of psychology and genetics. So whenever you see the word behavioral placed in front of another term, oftentimes medical, it involves some combination of the field of psychology with that other area. The field of behavioral genetics is a combination of how psychology and genetics are interrelated to each other. Where the field of behavioral genetics got started from came from the original ideas back from the theory of evolution in 1859 that all things are controlled by your genes. As time went by, it was theorized that there may be some role of the environment that would affect genes, but there was really very little technological capacity to study this. By approximately 1980, the cost of DNA testing actually came down sufficiently so that large-scale experiments could be conducted to see whether or not there were specific genes associated with particular patterns of behavior. And in fact, the first experiments at around 1980 generally tried to associate the role of genes with particular psychiatric disorders. In the first experiments, extreme forms of disorder like severe depression or paranoid schizophrenia was evaluated in populations that exhibited that characteristic in comparison to populations that did not have depression or schizophrenia. And in separate experiments evaluating those different disorders, measuring hundreds of people, researchers at the time had to sift through the entire genetic code to try to find a link between a particular gene and a disorder. So you might imagine it became a very expensive proposition at a time when DNA testing cost much more than it does today, and you didn't know where in the gene pool to actually look for the gene that might be related for depression. And as a result, you had to cover the entire sequence of genes. Through great effort, the results began to show that there were specific genes that were present for particular disorders. Experiments on severe depression were associated with genes. Paranoid schizophrenia was associated with genes. Obsessive compulsive disorder was associated with genes. And in fact, a variety of other disorders, as time goes by and the capacity to distinguish between different types of disorders, all involved research that eventually concluded that there was some role of genetics in the presence of those disorders. Since that time, the experimentation in the field of behavioral genetics has expanded to involve patterns of behavior that are not related to psychological disorders, but instead related to normal patterns of behavior, like expressing empathy or helpfulness or having math ability or a good ability to learn languages. The questions that we have right now are related to how can the environment influence your behavior and how can genes influence your behavior. Now, the role of the environment modifying your behavior is actually a rather simple one. That's kind of the perceptual world that most people live in. You leave your house, you interact with people, you experience all sorts of things like opportunities to donate money for charities, why people would commit crimes, why people would volunteer their time for an organization, are all fairly easily understood. How your genes influence those similar and other things is actually much more difficult to grasp because you don't see the role of your genes in your pattern of behavior. You can see how if you go to the supermarket and you're buying a loaf of bread and you're asked to donate money for children in need, that there's an embarrassment component in that case, where if you don't say no, you look like a cheapskate. And that's actually part of the process of collecting money in donations, to embarrass the person, to make them feel bad in front of other individuals. But how do your genes influence the likelihood that you would actually donate money? Nobody ever feels their genes kicking in, and it doesn't even seem reasonable to say that when you were asked to donate that some particular donation gene became suddenly active and you suddenly decided to pull out your wallet and give somebody money. That seems rather ridiculous. So to understand better how that more complicated story of genes influencing your behavior takes place, we have to continue on with our overall story here. The thing that we have to start talking about is the role of heritability. Heritability is the concept in that you inherit a trait from your parents. Your parents create you, and the entire universe of genes that make up both your mother and father combine together in random ways to produce you. So that means you won't automatically become a carbon copy of your mother or your father, and you won't necessarily have the exact same traits as them. But statistically, you should be much more likely to have characteristics similar to your mother or father as opposed to any other person outside of your family. And that is one of the things that the field of behavioral genetics has actually produced quite a bit of evidence for. When you evaluate personality traits, different forms of intelligence like math intelligence and language intelligence, the presence of different forms of psychological disorders, or temperament, which is your emotional reactivity to events, are all things that tend to be more statistically connected to your own parents than they are people outside of your family. And that indicates that your parents are actually passing traits to you and giving you some of your personality, some of your forms of intelligence or aptitude, some of the likelihoods for susceptibility for psychological disorders, giving you some degree of a basis for how you respond to new events. So let's take a look at this question. Which of the following is unlikely a heritable trait? And the answer there is E. All of the above are heritable. Since 1980 or so, the field of behavioral genetics has really expanded the patterns of behavior that have been investigated. And in fact, over the past 4 decades, there really has not been any psychological trait investigated that has not shown some genetic connection. So that is to say, no pattern of behavior that has been studied since the time that the field of behavioral genetics got started has shown that a pattern of behavior is either completely environmental or entirely biological. Every psychological pattern investigated over the past 4 decades has showed evidence that the pattern of behavior is modified by both genetics and the environment. The question that most researchers have today is, to what degree is a pattern of behavior weighted toward biology as opposed to weighted to the environment? So hypothetically, if you consider any pattern of behavior of a human being to be controlled by 2 primary factors, biology or environment, that would add up to 100% of all the control, because there would be nothing outside of biology or environment that could manage a human behavior. Consequently, that pattern of behavior, if it were 25% controlled by the biology, then it would have to be 75% controlled by the environment. And if it was 33% controlled by the environment, it would have to be 67% controlled by biology. And that's the way that researchers oftentimes think about the role of biology and the environment today. So you'll wind up seeing much more selective work done today on determining the weight of biology versus environment for a selective pattern, rather than a more general concern about whether or not a pattern of behavior is controlled by biology or environment. Because as I've said, for the past 4 decades, every pattern of behavior that has been investigated has shown evidence of both biological and environmental control. The main question now is, to what degree for any one particular response system is it controlled by biology as opposed to the environment? One common example I like to give is about eating. Everybody becomes hungry, and because that is a common human property, that you become hungry if you don't eat after a while, that should be very highly weighted toward biological function. However, you could modify that biological function by exposing people who are not hungry to really tasty treats, like very high-class 5-star chocolates, or even in my case, you could drive me past a Kentucky Fried Chicken and let me smell all the grease coming out of that building, and I would just start getting hungry for fried chicken, even though I may have already eaten lunch, because that chicken smells so good. There are lots of ways to entice a person to eat, even though they may not have to eat at the current time. And that's an environmental management of this biological process. So whether or not a person eats is in part determined by whether they're hungry and, of course, how good the food seems. Now, if you decide to eat, there's a wide range of things. We talked about earlier how most of the evidence indicates that human beings are omnivores. However, some of you may be on a paleo diet right now and eating mostly meat, and others of you may be on a vegan diet because you have decided not to eat meat. Under these circumstances, when you become hungry, which we may say is much more highly weighted toward a biological process, the decision about what to eat will be much more weighted toward an environmental process. If you have decided you're going to be a vegan, then you are making active choices about what types of food to eat. You're going to have to selectively find vegetables. In the case of a paleo diet, for example, if you find that that's going to be the best option for you, then you may only be able to eat meat or other things that are related to the paleo diet. But the broader story here is when you become hungry, it is most likely caused by an underlying biological process. But when you make the decision to eat, you have a very wide range of decisions to make about your food, which will be primarily based upon decision-making processes based upon your life in your particular culture. And that is going to be much more likely an environmental aspect. Now, when we talk about temperament, as we've seen on the previous slide, temperament refers to your overall level of emotional reactivity. Now, what temperament means is some people will change their emotional state very rapidly during the course of the day, and other people will have very consistent patterns of an emotional state. So, for example, some people will become very happy when something good happens and then very sad 5 minutes later. And then happy again 5 minutes after that when something else good happens. So their emotional states fluctuate wildly over the course of the day. Now, be aware that this is not a judgment of the process. It's just a recognition that some people have rapidly changing emotional states. Other individuals have very consistent patterns of emotion over the course of the day. They may remain at a mild happiness throughout the day, regardless of what actually happens, good or bad things. They don't become particularly happy and they don't become particularly sad. They kind of stay somewhere in the middle. That's generally what you're talking about when you're referring to temperament. And that aspect of temperament tends to be closely related to the pattern of temperament that's seen in your parents. And remember, transferring genes from parents to children in human beings is a fairly complicated story, a great deal of which is not known. But when you evaluate the personality characteristics and temperament of a father and a mother and compare those traits with their children, statistically, the children are more likely to show some trait from the father or mother or some nearly combination of those traits much more similarly than they would anybody from outside of the family. So as you see in behavioral genetic experiments on the heritability of temperament, it's found that emotional reactivity is much more similar between parent and child, that children respond more similarly to their parents over their lifetime. So if your father is a very quiet individual, you may be a rambunctious 18-year-old, but there's a higher statistical likelihood that you will become much more of a calm individual later on in your life. Temperament can change in limited ways due to the environment. That is an aspect of adaptability. No genetic trait that you appear to have seems to be extremely rigid and unchangeable. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. To say that a personality trait is genetic does not mean that it can't be changed. Genetic traits, even traits that are highly genetic, can still be modified by the environment. There's a great deal of flexibility between how the environment can manage genes and how the genes can modify your processing of the environment. Nothing is completely set in stone, but you can make these reasonable estimates based upon heritability from parents to children on the traits that they show, especially with respect to temperament. Now, this slide actually shows us some statistical evidence for the broad-based aspects of behavioral genetics. So essentially, over the past 40 years or so, the data of behavioral genetics experiments have been combined together to make overall estimate of genetic versus environmental control for all psychological processes. So what you're looking at on the screen is a statistical estimate that is essentially related to all forms of psychological processing, not one particular thing like math intelligence or personality traits, but all things combined together. And the way that this work is actually done in the field of behavioral genetics is to take the available opportunities to look at the similarity and differences of people based on their genetic and environmental similarities that exist in society. So, for example, suppose you had complete control over the genes of human beings. It would still be completely unethical for you to show up and to take people and adjust their genetic sequences so that their personality characteristics change, or to take men or women and switch their gender genetically because you had the capacity to do so. That would fall outside the realm of appropriate ethics. But what you can do, go out and find people that are genetically or environmentally similar to each other in their natural life and then measure it. So these data are ultimately correlational in nature, but they do show a consistent pattern that makes sense with respect to our understanding of nature and nurture today. So let's take a look at these groups that behavioral geneticists study. Identical twins. Identical twins are more similar than any two people on the planet. So they would have a great deal of genetic similarity, and if any psychological characteristic was really strongly controlled by genes, then that characteristic should exist in both of the twins. And then there are fraternal twins and siblings. Fraternal twins and siblings have the same degree of genetic similarity. Fraternal twins are created by 2 sperm and 2 eggs from the same 2 parents, as are siblings. It's just that siblings generally are conceived about a year apart from each other, at least, but the fraternal twins are conceived at roughly the same time. So the main difference you see is that the fraternal twins have a prenatal environment that is much more similar in their development than does the siblings that are born a year apart. And I know that may seem odd, but you're going to see that that prenatal environment at the same time actually does have some influence. And then adoptees. Adoptees refer to individuals from different families, but who live together. So the environment is the same, but their genes come from separate families. Now, in each of these cases, the individuals that you're referring to can either be raised together or raised apart. When you evaluate identical twins around the globe, you can find plenty of cases in which identical twins that were born were mostly raised together, but a significant number that are actually separated at birth, usually as a result of adoption processes. And you can then evaluate identical twins raised together who should be more similar than any two people on the planet, as opposed to identical twins that were raised apart, who, if genes were the only process relevant to their personality traits, should still be completely identical. But if the environment does have some role in managing their personality, then they should become more dissimilar. And in fact, that's exactly what you do see. Identical twins raised together are as similar as any two people on the planet, but when identical twins are raised apart, there's a small, about 10% drop in the degree of similarity. Note in these data, the drop from 0.86 to 0.76 indicates that a great deal of the overall characteristics of individuals is largely determined by genetics and not the environment. When you drop down to the fraternal twins, there is a reduction in the degree of similarity. Whether fraternal twins are raised together or raised apart, they are not as similar as identical twins. But consistent with identical twins, fraternal twins raised together are always more similar than fraternal twins raised apart. And fraternal twins and siblings have the same degree of genetic similarity. However, the siblings are going to be conceived at least a year apart from each other. Consequently, they will have a different prenatal environment. And you also see, comparing the degree of similarity of fraternal twins versus siblings, that there is again a drop. By being conceived a year later, there's actually less similarity between siblings than they would be if they actually were raised in the same prenatal environment. Now, when you talk about adoptees, we have that raised together, raised apart categorical system. Adoptees raised apart essentially means strangers, right? All of us, everybody from this class that comes from a different family and lives in a different household. That's what you might refer to as adoptees raised apart. That's just unrelated people living apart. So when we look at the adoptees category, we could say raised together versus unrelated people living apart. And you find very little correlation between adoptees raised together or individuals raised apart. In fact, the correlation drops nearly to zero. In the overarching story you see on this page, there's a tendency to believe that there's actually much more influence of the role of genetics than the environment. When all this information is actually combined together statistically, it indicates that there is about a 50% control overall in psychological traits related to genetics and 50% therefore related to the environment. That may not be obviously clear from looking at these numbers, but that statistical process is rather difficult and beyond the realm of this particular class. But the overarching statistical story indicates that the amount of variability between individuals is about 50% related to genes and 50% related to environment. So let's take a look at a question like this, where you're dealing with a family that has a large group of adoptees and parental children living in it as well. So using the table that we just looked at from the previous page, how similar will be Angelina Jolie's adopted and biological children's personalities and intelligence levels? And the answer there is C, about as similar as strangers. And the reason why you say about as similar as strangers, despite the fact that they're all raised together, is because as you see on the previous slide, which I'll jump back to, you're looking at a group of children, some of which are biologically related to Angelina Jolie, and a number have been adopted. And the statistical likelihood that you would have the similar types of personality traits, similar intellectual aptitudes, similar interests, and so forth, is going to be fairly low. In fact, the basic rule that you should grasp is the relationship between individuals that may be adopted and the individuals that raise them should actually be fairly low. Now, one of the ways to kind of look more deeply into the story would be to show you a movie related to how much parenting actually affects the development of personality. And that question, of course, prior to the 1980s, I should say, most of the assumptions by psychologists had been that upbringing actually influences personality type. After the work in behavioral genetics started to be completed, there was somewhat of a shift indicating that the role of genetics plays much more importance than previously thought. Now again, the overarching statistical estimate for all psychological traits across all individuals indicates that the amount of variability between individuals is about 50% controlled by biology and about 50% controlled by the environment. And with that as a context, take a look at this film that discusses these issues in more specific ways.
I'm free to look as an outsider at what the establishment has been producing and saying, hey, you guys, you've been following your own noses too long.
She says look at your own evidence with new eyes. Take twin studies. Here are Debbie Melman and Sharon Posette, separated at birth, adopted, and raised by two different sets of parents in two separate households. Reunited just a couple of years ago, they turned out, well, hard to tell apart.
You're standing here and you're there.
Yeah, you're there.
But
and your voice
you know
is
you're not there
because you're here.
Twins who are split up are just as similar in personality as twins who are reared together. And that can't really be explained by the idea that the home environment is what, makes you turn out the way you are.
What does determine what sort of adult you'll become?
Well, that's a very good question. Part of the answer is genes. We've always known that. But the question is what besides genes makes people turn out the way they do.
Harris believes children are molded by the people they hang out with, the kids, the peer group.
Oh my God, you're 300.
I believe that human beings are designed by evolution to adapt to a group and to become a accepted and valuable member of a group. And that this is the child's goal almost from the beginning. What they have to do is to look for a group of people that are like themselves, figure out how that group of people acts, and a child tries to adapt his or her behavior to the behavior of the group.
Harris says this adaptation is evident in immigrant families. The Jaws came from China 12 years ago, but Mom and Dad haven't been able to master any English. Not so the children. Harris says they don't just speak the language, they do it with barely the trace of an accent. And that proves that children adapt to the group. One of the most influential linguists in this country agrees with her. Chairman of psychology at MIT, Steven Pinker.
Kids are acutely sensitive to the fine nuances of what other kids are saying, and the way their parents talk makes no difference.
Pinker regards the Harris book as a turning point in the history of psychology.
What Harris is simply saying is get rid of the illusion that you can mold your child like silly putty, that how you treat your child is going to determine the kind of grown-up they become.
Harris hit upon her theory almost by accident, reading a study about adolescents who commit minor crimes, which concluded that youngsters acted out because they were trying to be like adults.
And I said, wait a minute, teenagers aren't doing these stupid things because they want to be like adults. If they wanted to be like adults, they'd be doing boring things like figuring out their taxes or sorting the laundry. They're trying to show that they can thumb their nose at adult customs and rules. And that gave me the idea that teenagers identified with a group called teenagers.
She quotes studies on teenage smoking that found that kids took up the habit not because their parents smoked, but because their friends did. Dr. Alan Sarof at the University of Minnesota has dedicated his career to studying parents and their children. He says Harris just ignores evidence that contradicts her theory, including his work.
There's been research for 30 years showing that what peers primarily influence are superficial aspects of behavior. How you dress, music preferences, slang vocabulary, hairstyles, makeup styles. But what parents influence more, your basic moral character, your values, your conscience.
One of the things that immediately comes to mind is these kids in Oregon, Mississippi, Arkansas, who shoot their classmates. And we usually jump to the conclusion that something was wrong at home.
We should not jump to that conclusion. I think this is a terrible tragedy for the parents of these children, and that they deserve our compassion and not to be blamed. What I notice about these children is that very often they've been rejected by their peers and that they're unhappy for that reason.
You feel that it's more critical that the child adapt well in the peer group than that the child be happy at home.
In the long run, yes.